the review of Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari. We're in Chapter 2, Section 5, in the middle of that chapter. Today is 5/26/2020. So, were there any questions or comments on what we read yesterday? I guess one of the main things that we talked about was foreclosure. And I think I was on the Lacanian reading group, and they mentioned what foreclosure was, which was when you put something completely out of your mind rather than pressing it.
I mean, one thing I was just struck by in this section was how clear the metaphor of the parents as wrestlers on page 96. I just thought that really kind of hit home how the relationality of the parents kind of disavows any, ultimate closing of the Oedipal triangle. And I thought that was a really nice metaphor for understanding that.
Now, is that in the paragraph that starts "we believe"?
Yeah, I think I might have actually just jumped a paragraph. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay, because I didn't remember that metaphor, but okay. So it's precisely this pairing of the parental figures with agents of another nature, their locking embrace similar to wrestlers, that keeps the triangle from closing up again and being valid in itself, from claiming to express or represent this different nature of the agents that are in question in the unconscious itself. Okay, so wrestlers, that is the metaphor that is at the center of Critique of Dialectical Reason. Sartre uses wrestlers and the wrestling match, and he kind of analyzes the wrestling match, and talks about how there's all of these different roles. There are the wrestlers, there are the agents, there are the trainers, there is the audience. That there's a whole context there in the wrestling match.
Yeah, he was deeply he admired the sport of boxing pretty deeply. So I think that's a good way to use that.
Oh, was it boxing rather than wrestling?
Yeah, I still think that it applies. I still think that what he has to say in CDR applies pretty well over here.
Oh, okay.
I think that's a good line to draw.
Yeah, sorry, I got the wrong one.
It's so pedantic. Don't worry about it.
So but I always like that part of Critique of Dialectical Reason because it's all about the relationship between the system and the meta system, everything around it, or the general economy in relation to the restricted economy. It's not just the fighters, which would be the two dialectical elements that are in conflict. There's a whole context for that conflict, and Sartre does a good job of pointing that out. I think maybe I hit on wrestlers because when I was a kid, my dad liked to go to wrestling matches, and he took me there instead of boxing matches.
I think, though, that the social organization of those spaces are almost identical. And I think you see the role that CDR plays in Anti-Oedipus throughout. I think later in the text, they'll specifically cite groups in fusion, which is a concept that's central to Critique of Dialectical Reason. So
they do cite that? Oh, that's great.
Yeah, much later though, like around 220, I think, in the edition we're using. So
okay, yeah, I can't wait to get there because that's my my background's sociology. So
cool.
so I was always interested in the sociological aspects, and Critique of Dialectical Reason was like perfect in that.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that I take the fused group as being an example of wild being.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I wrote a paper. I think it was the second one in this series of papers about Anti-Oedipus, and in which I try to show that there's a connection between Simondon and Critique of Dialectical Reason by Sartre, because they have Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason starts where Simondon ends. Simondon ends with the collective.
Mm-hmm.
Sartre starts with the collective, and then out of the collective, he the fused group forms, and then the pledged group comes out of that, and then the
pledge. That was the word I was looking for in a conversation about Sartre yesterday.
Yeah. So the pledged group, and then the organized group, where the group self-organizes, like we've done here.
Yeah, no, if you're looking, if anybody's like confused about what Ken's talking about, William McBride wrote a great book on Sartre's politics and his political writings that basically is just a conceptual breakdown of everything present in texts like Search for a Method and the broader Critique of Dialectical Reason. And it even goes a little bit into existentialism as a humanism and being and nothingness, about the politics laden in there. So I'll put that title in there if anybody's confused.
Yeah, I'd like to see that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Recently I've been trying to read some of the background material on Critique of Dialectical Reason. But then after the organization, then there's the institution where things get instituted, and then made into institutions, and then Cornelius Castoriadis writes The Imaginary Institution of Society, where he talks about institutions in relationship to wild beings. So that connection to CDR here, I think, is quite significant. So any other points you'd like to make about the reading or anything else in the book? I mean, I thought in this first paragraph on page 90 that we started with, in this case, as in many others, they're going through the imaginary, symbolic, and real, and bringing them to bear in their analysis.
Yeah, I think this is where someone with a good understanding of Lacan's treatment of the Oedipal would be uniquely helpful, because I know that on page 96, they finally make the assertion there is no Oedipal triangle. Oedipus is always open and in an open social field. So how they get from the utilization of the Lacanian concept of foreclosure to essentially that placement of the Oedipal the open triangle on the open social field is one thing that I'm particularly confused with, that I still struggle with.
And I think one of the things I thought about after we read yesterday was that, and I think I mentioned it briefly, was I think the reason they're focusing on foreclosure is because it's the more radical of the two, between repression and foreclosure. Because I think repression is like forgetfulness, whereas foreclosure is like oblivion. So oblivion is much more a much more radical rendering of something unconscious. just.
Can you expand on the rendering of the unconscious there? I think I'm following you, but I'm not exactly sure.
Well, okay, so one of the things I liked about this book when I read it a long time ago was they somewhere in there they say something like, if you're conscious of it at all, then it's not the. So then when you look at Freud, he's got all this pre-conscious stuff, and then Jung is full of things that people are conscious of, like archetypes in religion. And so that's not really the unconscious, if there's any consciousness of it at all. And one book that I'd like to mention in this regard is Michel Henry, The Essence of Manifestation. So in that book, Henry kind of attacks Heidegger and what he calls Heidegger's ontological monism. Because, even though he says that Heidegger says that being is a combination of ready to hand and present, what I call pure being and process. It's one thing, but in it there's manifestation. Whereas, and so Heidegger doesn't allow the possibility that there is something that is never met. And that's what Henry calls the essence of manifestation, thing which is never met. So that's the radical unconscious. And it seems like Deleuze and Guattari, they want to differentiate between the transcendent radical unconscious and the transcendental radical. So the transcendental is the passive syntheses that we know are there because we're given things whole in our conscious. So we know that the passive syntheses are there because things suddenly pop whole into our consciousness. But the transcendent is, the actual workings that we don't know how it works at all, and we don't really know what's going on. And even with brain imaging and stuff like that, we know what's happening within the brain to produce consciousness and then to produce these passive syntheses that we experience. So I mean, basically, the upshot of this is that both in Freud and in Jung, there's these quasi-conscious elements that are not really unconscious. So Henry's work is trying to define something like the unconscious of manifestation or being.
And you see that operating here?
I see that as the fundamental question behind this whole book is,
okay.
What is the transcendent unconscious? Yeah. And what is this transcendental unconscious?
No, I think sometimes the phenomenological, but also like the Kantian elements of this text can sometimes be overlooked, and I think that's part of the reason why I'm often left confused, because I don't iron those parts out before diving into the description on it.
Yeah, I just read a book called I think it was called Kant, Deleuze, and the Architectonic, which is a Deleuzian interpretation of Kant. And it's a very good interpretation. It's really interesting. But I mean, there's quite a few interpreters that are trying to take it back, what Deleuze is saying here, back to critique of pure reason. And in some ways, you can see this book as a kind of rewriting critique of pure reason. And you can see that in the fact that he's talking about these paralogisms, and that's one of the highlights of critique of pure reason are the paralogisms of reason. But just because in this first paragraph it's dealing with imaginary, symbolic, and real, I just like to mention this idea I've had of a way of interpreting that, which I don't know if it's right. I liked it, which was that, well, one of the things I realized was that Sartre doesn't have any story about how the for itself arises out of the in itself, how self-consciousness arises out of just things. And so you can see Lacan's mirror stage as giving a story about that. And so then in terms of the imaginary, symbolic, and real, you can see that like in the child's development, at first, the child is just living in their body, like an animal, for instance. But then, so that's the real, and then, or reality with small r. But then there's the mirror stage, in which the child recognizes itself in the mirror, and that's the imaginary. And then they become linguistically competent in their natural language, and then that's like the symbolic. But that doesn't account for the idea of the real as that which cannot be symbolized, that which cannot be imagined, which is real with a capital R that Zizek talks about. Anyway, I just mentioned that interpretation because that's in this first paragraph that we read yesterday. So any other comments or questions?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I would like to ask about this paragraph is that what do they mean by the double bind in this paragraph specifically?
Where is that in the paragraph about the double bind?
They talk about the double binds flinging from one pole to the other, and then they keep on talking about the imaginary and the real. And I don't understand the message that is flinging from one to the other.
Well, I mean, I think we were interpreting one pole to the other being between father and mother, but when we were reading it yesterday, I got the idea that they meant something else. But I wasn't sure what that was. It says the law of the double bind operates relentlessly, ruthlessly, flinging us from one pole to the other in such a way that what is foreclosed in the symbolic must reappear in the real in a hallucinatory form. And then it says, but in this fashion, the entire historico-political theme gets interpreted as a constellation of imaginary identification. So I think those imaginary identifications are, all of the identifications that the schizophrenic would make with the hordes and the peoples moving across the landscape and so forth.
May they be talking about the deliriums the schizophrenic has?
Well, I think that's right. I think that when they're talking about real in a hallucinatory form, that's the delirium. And what's foreclosed in the symbolic, which is that which is completely put out of mind, symbolic, and so is truly unconscious because it's lost in oblivion. I'd just like to mention that my favorite scene in that regard is from Zarathustra, where he comes down from the mountain and he goes and talks to the sea. That's like a really good example of that.
I hate to put you on the spot, but can you expand a little bit on that?
Okay, well, the reason I didn't say very much is that I don't know if I can remember it, but it's a beautiful passage where he goes from climbing the mountain and which is also a beautiful passage where he's climbing the mountain, and then there's a moment in which as he puts down his foot, the mountain comes up to meet it.
Yeah.
And so he's climbing, the mountain is being created as he's climbing. And then he talks about how he's climbing over his own head.
Okay. Yeah. No,
which is kind of like the absurdity of transcendence, which is that, the whole idea of transcending yourself. And then from that scene, the next, after a while, the next scene is him going down to the sea and basically seeing the sea as never forgetting anything. And that whatever's done on earth, whatever atrocities are committed, that they leave their traces and that they're not forgotten. And so he talks about the sea as if it was remembering all of these things that were done that people tried to hide, but ultimately couldn't hide, and in the end come up again. And so that's kind of like the oblivion, even if you completely wipe out the traces of something, still the traces of your wiping it out are still. And so things do return from oblivion, which is kind of like a return, in the forgetfulness, that's like the return of the repressed, but there is a return from oblivion too. For instance, a perfect example of that are the tablets on which Gilgamesh was written. They were totally lost. And then through archaeology, they found these tablets scattered all over the Middle East, and they pieced back together the first epic that was written. So then we got a source deeper than the Iliad and the Odyssey from our tradition that was totally lost in oblivion, but traces were still there on the tablets. We found those tablets, but everyone had forgotten that it existed through history. And then, by the way, when they unearthed those and put them together, they found out there was a reference to Noah and the flood. It was in the Bible, so then everyone got interested in it.
I'd like to go back to the double bind for a moment.
Sure.
Because there are two earlier sections where they talk about the double bind that I think can help here.
Okay.
The first starts on page 78 and goes on to 79, where they formulate the second paralogism of psychoanalysis. They say there, here we have the second paralogism of psychoanalysis. In short, the double bind is none other than the whole of Oedipus. It is in this sense that Oedipus should be presented as a series or an oscillation between two poles. The neurotic identification and the internalization that is said to be normative. On either side is Oedipus, the double impasse. And if a schizo is produced here as an entity, This occurs for the simple reason that there is no other means of escaping this double path, where normality is no less blocked than neurosis, and where the solution offers no more of a way out than does the problem. Hence, the schizo's withdrawal to the body without organ.
Yeah, so that makes it so the poles are the normality and the kind of perversion, the breaking of taboo. Is that how you read that?
Yeah. Well, there's another section, and this is the footnote on page 82, where they reference an article of which they say this article contains a perfect formulation of Oedipus as a double bind, and then they quote, "The psychic life of a man unfolds in a sort of dialectical tension between two ways of living the Oedipus complex, one that consists in living it, and the other that consists in living according to the structures that might be called Oedipi. Experience also shows us that these structures are not foreign to the most critical phase of this complex. For Freud, man is definitively marked by this complex. It constitutes both his grandeur and his misery."
So living it would have been the normal life, but the other one is the structural. They're saying it's the structures. That's interesting.
Where in this formulation of the double bind? So if we stay in the double bind, how does the double bind relate to foreclosure?
Well, it's a good, because they're saying, I mean, the implication that I get from what you just read is that they're saying there's just normally living within the Oedipus complex and not questioning. And then there is the breaking of that taboo, and which is kind of the extraordinary reaction to the double bind. But they're saying that that's structural. And the way you can see that is that, what structures are all of the possibilities. So all of the possibilities are, incest, all of the aberrant behavior that the Oedipal complex is trying to stamp out. There's this whole thing of you don't make laws against things that don't happen. So the fact that there is a taboo means that does happen, and the problem is that challenges the whole patriarchal system is based on knowing who is the father of the child. So the whole idea of the incest taboo is to it's not just the incest between brother and sister or son and mother, but it's also part of that complex is the fact that there's marriage and the determination of who is the father of whatever children, so that you can differentiate between your children and the children of others. And patriarchy is founded on that principle, which in matriarchy is not a thing. It's not the same, because women stay with the father in matriarchy, and the husbands just come in for visits, and then it's the brother of the mother that acts as father. So it's kind of a different kind of system. But how that relates to foreclosure, I just have no.
Yeah, on foreclosure. So in the first, 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 in the first in the first section that I read, just before that, they use as an example for the double bind the situation where the father says to the son, "Go ahead, criticize me," but strongly hints that all effective criticism, or at least a certain type of criticism, will be very unwelcome, will be followed by punishment in some capacity. So there would foreclosure here be ignoring this tension? So
well, foreclosure is putting something completely out of mind, and so that you kind of forget that it was even an issue.
In that situation, the demand is to forget or completely deny the possibility of a certain kind of criticism.
Yeah, well, see, the thing is, this thing about criticism, that is the kind of thing that I think of as a double bind. This thing about the two poles of normality and abnormality, that is a kind of deeper kind of polarity, which is kind of like the nihilistic opposite. You know, instead of a specific instance of contradiction. You know, double binds are basically contradictions, and that are kind of socially constructed within the family. And so, but you know, basically they're saying that leads to this situation where, well, I mean, I don't really know how to characterize it. It's kind of like if you do all the things that the superego tells you to do, then you don't have an interesting life, and because you're completely succumbing to normality. And then on the other hand, if you push all the boundaries and go beyond all boundaries, then that's kind of like the nihilistic opposite of nothing happening. There's too much happening. I don't know how to characterize these two poles we're talking about, but just trying. And so that nihilistic situation that's produced by having a taboo in the first place is a deeper thing than just an individual contradiction, like your father saying, "Okay, go ahead and criticize me," but you know they've got their fist ready to punch you if you do something like that.
I think double bind comes from that they say that foreclosure is possible, but it is not, because in all the poles of the two poles of the Oedipus, you get to the same point where even if it is internalized or it is forced upon you, you cannot escape it. So if you are believing that you are passive, then they go on to tell that you are not, in the example of egg. If you believe to think that you are passive, then the foreclosure is never possible.
Yeah, I don't quite know how to. Could you just say that again? What how does that relate to foreclosure?
I mean, they say that if you escape something from in the symbolic, it reappears in the real. So that if you think that if you are Oedipalized, it is something, but if you are not, then you are living in an Oedipal structure. So you cannot really escape it. So this is the contradiction in what I understand in the limited sense. And then they go on to talk about the biological egg and how they thought that something was forced upon it, but it had the potentiality to be something else. So the structure or the possibilities of the structure was coming from within and not from forced upon stuff. So the biological egg part doesn't really relate to the foreclosure, but I believe that the idea of foreclosure comes from that something is outside of you instead of that you are in control of that thing. The foreclosure comes from something that is external, that you need to be oblivious to something that is external. But if all the possibilities are within yourself, or like you're an egg with possibilities, then the foreclosure, the term of foreclosure in my sense doesn't make sense.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I mean, you know that, okay, what? There's these two terms that they have. One is incorporation, which means that you absorb something. And then there's another one, which I don't know what that term is. I keep forgetting it, which means that something comes in, but then you have to expel it again. Does anyone know what that term is? That's the opposite of incorporation? Expulsion. Well, maybe, I don't know. Unfortunately, I can't remember, but it's a psychological term for that difference. And it seems like, you know, that might be what you're talking about. The foreclosure of internal things versus foreclosure of external things. I mean, you're probably right. That is a thing. Because, you know, it's probably easier to ignore something in your environment, in a certain sense, than something that's welling up inside you.
Yeah, I mean, they say that parental figures are not organizers, but rather inductors. So they're like something that signals something else. So maybe, yeah, foreclosure from inside is maybe, yeah, might be related to what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, this point of inductors versus organizers, you know, that's like the inductors are like a field concept where you're being influenced by things in your environment, but say you're developing as a child, going through your developmental process, and then the people in your environment are you know, say like reading books to a child. I mean, if no one ever reads a book to you, then, you know, your view of reading is going to be different from if your parents read to you on a regular basis. You know, that's kind of like one of the main indicators of whether, you know, how quickly a child is going to you know, take on reading in school. If the parents think it's important, they'll read to the child. So that's kind of inductor for a certain kind of behavior. And you can see that, you know, like parents who homeschool their kids, you know, the parents are acting as an organizer rather than the child going off to school and interacting with a whole bunch of other people, and then the parents are just kind of like home base for the child who's having the school experience rather than organizing the school experience. So I mean, I think that's kind of like the difference between inductors and organizers.
Also, I think maybe it's also about how later in Anti-Oedipus they explain that Oedipus is real, right? It's not that Freud and Lacan are imagining it, but it's also only possible under capitalism. And they're going to want to emphasize that that particular like familial formation is directly determined by the social formation. That's a really big critique of even Lacan as well. So maybe that's, I don't know how it relates to foreclosure, but in terms of the family as an inductor, They might be using the word in a different context, but my reading of it was just that the family is kind of the inductor of the broader forces of the social field into a family, and therefore the way that the child is raised. There was a passage I was reading later. It is from much later in Anti-Oedipus, but I can find it. So they actually get pretty explicit about this later. And please, if I'm going off off topic for what you what you're actually trying to say, just let me know. But so what we say is that private persons are images of the second order, images of images, that is, simulacra that are thus endowed with an aptitude for representing the first order images of social persons. These private persons are formally delimited in the locus of the restricted family as father, mother, and child. And then they go on to say that the father, mother, and child thus become the simulacrum of the images of capital, Mr. Capital, Madam Earth, and the child the worker, with the result that these images are no longer recognized at all in the desire, but is determined to invest only their simulacrum. The familial determinations become the application of the social axiomatic. So I don't know how that relates to foreclosure. It's not a concept I understand very well. But maybe that's what they're on about in terms of the family as an inductor.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting you read that, because it kind of shows that we're going to get into wilder and wilder territory as we keep going here.
Oh yeah, I mean, chapter three for me is where it gets really interesting, because if their whole thesis is that private individual oppression is sort of determined by the social field, then you're gonna have to do a pretty good job explaining what that social field is like, right? Which is what they spend in like 150 pages doing, something like that. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I kind of wonder whether any of this has been absorbed into sociology, whether sociology has ever gotten around to Deleuze and Guattari or not.
Latour, basically.
Okay.
Bruno Latour is basically all Deleuze and Guattari.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought so when I was reading him. I thought this whole ACT, agent network theory, seems like, basically the same thing, only kind of made more concrete.
Oh, well, I think his later work is more obvious about it. So I actually did not really, I haven't actually read anything by him before the 90s. So I only know his later stuff.
Oh, I see.
And there he's really just saying it.
Oh, okay. Did you read Reassembling the Social?
No, not yet. I'm currently rereading We've Never Been Modern, and you'll find a lot of Deleuzian concepts there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't read that. I'd like to read. Okay, sorry.
But about the inductors and organizers, so I read it as that the difference is basically that organizers really determine the structure of the outcome, right? So organizers organize what happens. They relate the parts to another so that they form some kind of network or structure or a whole. They really build the relations, and the inductors only give some impulse, and then the parts arrange themselves. So the inductors are, as they say on page 81, inductors. The nature of these inductors is a matter of indifference. Many different kinds of substances and materials, when killed, boiled, and pulverized, have the same effect.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right.
And there's another passage I just found. It's almost directly after the one I was just reading. They say, everything is reduced to the father-mother-child triangle, which reverberates the answer daddy-mummy every time it is stimulated by the images of capital. In short, Oedipus arrives. It is born in the capitalist system of the application of first-order social images to the private familial images of a second order. It is the aggregate of destination that corresponds to an aggregate of departure that is socially determined. It is our intimate colonial formation that corresponds to a form of social sovereignty. We are all little colonies, and it is Oedipus that colonizes us. So that's sort of how I read. It's a great line, but it's also how I read the idea of inductors. It's less that they formally or like in any kind of intentional way structure the family. It's just that in a kind of causal way, the structure of those familial relations really are just the corresponding structure of capital itself. And so what the inductors do is they sort of simply let in or allow to replicate those structures, which is why Deleuze and Guattari also have a kind of role for, if I'm allowed to use the word agency here, because as Guattari, I was reading Three Ecologies earlier, he thinks that a lot of what needs to happen for the left is going to be this kind of micro-political struggle. It's going to be how we arrange our own lives and our own communities and things, our family relations, our social relations, these sorts of areas, which I suppose makes sense if you consider it in that way. The family in this way is sort of letting in or allowing to reproduce these social relations. Then there's something to be done there politically, I suppose.
Yeah, the difference between organizer and inductor is kind of like the parent telling the child what to do, and then maybe not doing that themselves, versus leading by example. The inductor is more leading by example. In other words, the parent goes about their own business and the child sees how that is and maybe mimics it, rather than being told exactly by the parent what to do and then having to deal with the contradiction that the parent isn't doing what they say.
Well, yeah, there's also, I thought of it more like that there's, an organizer would deny the possibility of the child not doing what the parent says, right? Like, an inductor, you tell the child to do something and the child will do something, but you don't know whether what the child does is actually what you told them to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, another example is like yes/no questions versus open-ended. When you ask an open-ended question, you don't know what the response is going to be. Whereas if you can ask questions that are very specific, and then that's going to get a very specific response. So you're organizing what the response is in the question versus just opening up, a realm in which a whole lot of things could come out. and then that's related back to this major theme in Heidegger, which is, letting something be, kind of having reticence, where you kind of withdraw and let the thing be, whatever it turns out to be, rather than, controlling what does appear.
So to connect this a bit to what's going on in chat right now, I think we could go back to foreclosure for a moment, because
Sure.
I think something that we kind of ignored talking about up to now is why they talk exactly about foreclosure. Well, they are very clear about the problem in this first sentence of our section here. They say, in this case, as in many others, the utilization of the Lacanian concept of foreclosure leads to the forced Edipolization of the rebel. The absence of Oedipus is interpreted as a lack with regard to the father, a gaping hole in the structure. So they are not utilizing foreclosure themselves here in this text. They analyze how foreclosure is used in Lacanian psychoanalysis. And what it does is that it enables psychoanalysis to problematize both the over-identification with the father, as well as as not identifying with the father. That's the double bind. Mm-hmm. You can't escape Oedipus. If you are too deep in Oedipus, you have a problem. If you do not, if you are not in Oedipus or claim to be not in Oedipus, then you just foreclosed the father, right? He's there, but you can't see him. Uh-huh. That's foreclosure. So. Right. Does foreclosure connect to the double bind? I think
that makes sense. That makes sense to me. That would be a kind of double bind, right? And Deleuze and Guattari do talk about something like this. So you may well be right, but they're thinking of something like disclosure there, where the problem is either you submit and internalize Oedipus, but even that's still an ongoing process you can't complete, or if you push back and refuse to internalize it, you foreclose it, you're even more in need of correction, right? So it's a double bind again, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you said internalize, and I think that's the other term, incorporation and internalization. And what's weird right. about the Freudian use of that is that incorporation is to absorb the thing without a problem, whereas internalization is to internalize something which should be foreign and needs to be pushed out again. And it always seemed to me that those two terms, at least in the English, should be the opposite. But anyway, I just never liked that terminological difference. But I mean, you can see that the person who does everything that his father wants him to do, that's one response, and then the person who fights, whatever his father wants, and rebels against it, that's the other. But the rebellion brings the system down on. And in some way, this is a nihilistic situation because, there can be problems at both ends of that extreme. And most people are in the middle somewhere. They rebel sometimes and they do what society wants to do in other cases. I just like to mention that, in my kind of an own analysis of the Western worldview, this is the major thing that the Western worldview is creating is nihilism in all areas of life. And so this is like this whole problem of nihilism. There is some philosophical literature on it, but I think it's a bigger issue than the literature might suggest.
Funnily enough, when I first applied to do my PhD, probably about 3 years ago now, that was actually the project I proposed doing. What you just said, Ken, was sort of an examination of the kind of almost structural problems which presented nihilism as an existential problem. I also think that's what Nietzsche was doing in his own way as well. I think Nietzsche's entire project was fundamentally an attack on nihilism, because he saw it as sort of the necessary outcome of a particular Western worldview, which was starting to set in. So I think you're right. I was just going to read again. I'm sorry for reading stuff from later in the book. It's just this bit does come back to what we were just talking about. It's also one of my favorite passages in the entire book. It's a little bit long, but you'll see when I come towards the end of it exactly why it's relevant, I think. Quote, "The extreme spiritualization of a despotic state and the extreme internalization of a capitalist field define bad conscience." So he's getting Nietzsche in here again. "The latter is not cynicism's contrary. It is in private persons the correlate of the cynicism of social persons. All the cynical tactics of bad conscience, just as Nietzsche and then Lawrenson and Miller analyzed them to arrive at a definition of civilized European man. The hypnosis and array of images, the torpor they spread, the hatred of life and all that is free, all that passes and flows, the universal effusion of the death instinct. Depression and guilt used as a means of contagion, the kiss of a vampire. Aren't you ashamed to be happy? Follow my example. I won't let you go until you say it's my fault." The permissive structure. "Let me deceive, rob, slaughter, kill, but in the name of the social order, and so Daddy Mummy will be proud of me. The double direction given to resentiment, the turning back against oneself and the projection against the other. The father is dead. It's my fault. Who killed him? It's your fault. It's the Jews, the Arabs, the Chinese, all the resources of racism and segregation. The abject desire to be loved, the whimpering of not being loved enough and not being understood, concurrent with the reduction of sexuality to the dirty little secret, this whole priest's psychology. There is not a single one of these tactics that does not find in Oedipus its land of milk and honey, its good provider. Nor is there a single one of these tactics that does not serve and develop in psychoanalysis, with the latter as the new avatar of the ascetic ideal." So I've had something else. I just love that passage, but I think it does actually. We were talking earlier, right? About someone mentioned the idea of sort of the death of the father, and how that gets sort of what the response to that is, right? This is basically what I just read is how I think it ends up working. Today is the father is dead. It's my fault. Who killed him? And the first response is, it's your fault. It's the Jews, the Arabs, the Chinese, racism and segregation. And that's sort of the tying up the sort of the individual psychoanalytic side of it to the social forces as well, in terms of what sort of the death of the father looks like and means and engenders, I suppose.
What page was that on?
So I'm on the Bloomsbury edition, but it's page 308 on my one. It's basically 2 or 3 pages before chapter 4 starts on Introduction to Schizoanalysis. So if you just find the start of chapter 4 and go like 4 or 5 pages back from there.
Yeah, that's really a great quote. Well, I'm glad to get these previews of what's to come, because it's gotten to the point where we're feeling like we're just plodding through this. In a way, because this is a long chapter and we couldn't read it in one setting, kind of, a little bit feel like we're stuck here. But well, since you're interested in problem of nihilism, I just mentioned the insight that I had when I was doing my dissertation on this, which was that nihilism and emergence are related to each other, and so the thing is that nihilism is like the background on which emergence appears. So it's the too dark on which the too light appear, and so the emergent thing comes along, and you think like when the World Wide Web became a thing, and then everyone said this is going to solve all of our problems.
Yeah. And
then we got pornography, we got hackers, we got viruses, we got So it starts off the emergent event seems like it's it's light coming in to into the darkness to illuminate everything in a new way. But then you find out that new thing is an intensification of nihilism, not something that's going to save you or give redemption or.
Yeah, there's a part I was reading earlier by in Guattari's Three Ecologies where he said basically that the entire entertainment media complex, it really comes down to a kind of distraction technique to help people sort of forget about this more fundamental problem they're facing, and to just keep people distracted, which I thought was a really interesting way. And obviously, we're thank you for mentioning. We don't want to mine and Kent's discussion to sidetrack us too much, but yeah, I mean, Deleuze and Guattari both do have these concerns in this book, and I think that's where you kind of get this ethical dimension to it as well. If I can sort of use that word with a book like this, because I'm going to do it again. I'm going to give you a little taster again, just because one of the things they're going to say is that the fundamental axiomatic of previous societies was these various sort of systems of codes and traditions and so on, and that the only axiomatic of capitalism is essentially money. And what it does is it reduces everything down to a single line of equivalence, which Guattari then expands on in the Three Ecologies to say that that's exactly what happens with the natural world and the environment, right? Is that it's all placed in a chain of equivalence, and then presumably there's, as usual, one despotic signifier, presumably just money or capital, right?
Well, part of that is using the environment as resources and just, stealing those resources from the community, taking them from the planet, but then selling them to make lots of money. So it's not just capital; it's also resources, and that's kind of what's become the problem.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of what Heidegger says, right, in the question concerning technology, that the thing about technology is what it really does is it frames everything as a kind of standing reserve, or something which could potentially be used and exploited and transformed.
Sure. Yeah.
We were allowed a little bit of Heidegger without Deleuze, I think.
Yeah. So anyway, we're open to anyone else has some other questions they'd like to talk about, or some other particular part of the text that they'd like to discuss. We'd like to do that.
Also, if anyone wants to be unmuted, sorry, I mean, just put a message in there. We'll get you unmuted. It's fine.
Well, I went through and unmuted everyone before. Oh, here's another. Some people have. Yeah, in the reviews, people are supposed to be unmuted so that they can just speak.
Yeah, everyone's now unmuted on this end, so if anyone wants to jump in, that's absolutely fine.
How about Plenty? Do you have anything to contribute? We are still on Consumption-Consummation, but
damn it, Kent! I was trying to. I asked it in the text chat so I could sort of pretend that I knew what I was doing when I got involved in this recap session.
Oh, okay. No mic. No mic. Okay.
Yeah. So in this one on Consumption-Consummation, I find it a strange but interesting one. Like for me, I've said this before a few times, but I can't help but to see it as a kind of recapitulation of Nietzsche in terms of what subjectivity is. Who you are at any given moment is essentially the contingent outcome of the interplay of various different wills within you, and we experience it sort of Is Jack here? No, he's not. Okay, so he's not going to take me to task about me using the word after effect. But subjectivity essentially is an after effect. That's what they're kind of trying to get at in this section. You don't, control the intensities. You're not responsible for them. You're kind of this thing which only really exists through the consumption of those intensities. Which doesn't mean we don't. I don't think I've done some reading since I last thought about this. I don't think Deleuze and Guattari are going to want to say that we don't have sort of, in some sense, free will. They're not really hard determinists in that sense. Even on the sort of macro, sort of metaphysical level.
I think they'd go with Bergson on that one. I can't really recapitulate. Yeah, you know what I mean. Bergson's whole argument, but he makes a very strong case of abandoning the whole distinction between determinism and free will.
Yeah, and that's sort of emerged a little bit in the analytic side as well. It's called compatibilism, I think, right? Where there's these positions like determinism, like there's hard or soft determinism, and then there's libertarianism, I suppose, as a sort of free will view. And a compatibilist is someone who believes that there is this kind of mechanically hard determinist view, but it's just not incompatible with free will, which always struck me as a little bit of yeah, that'll be probably my mic. Sorry, I live in the countryside. That one struck me as a cop out, but that's not really what Bergson's going on about, from what I remember. It's just that the traditional idea of free will doesn't really hold to scrutiny. I don't think that's his idea, right?
Yeah, it has to do with his conception of time. I can't do it, not in English, and not from the top of my dome.
Yeah, I've been reading a book called Apprehending the Inaccessible by Askey and Farquhar. And I'm finding that really interesting. They're bringing up a lot of things I hadn't heard of before. And one of them is the connection between Freud and Schopenhauer, and how both of them are determinists that don't believe in free will. So I guess I'm not sure where Deleuze and Guattari come down on that yet. I haven't seen that in the text so far. But, if you just look at it from the point of view of complexity theory, then, with emergence, you get, determinism is kind of like assuming that you can't open up into an emergent space that's different from where you're in. So if you're determined at one level, when you open up into this emergent space, then there's freedom in that level that doesn't exist down at the other level. So freedom and determination is a more complex thing than, usually it's given credit for, because there's these different emergent levels, and at the different emergent levels, there's going to be freedom at each level, and determination at that level. It's freedom from the level before, but determination by the rules of the new rules at the new emergent level. But I'd just like to mention on page 92, this statement, the operation of the unconscious upon itself. Basically, the sentence is, but believing is an operation of consciousness or preconscious nature, an extrinsic perception rather than an operation on consciousness itself. So, I think these syntheses we're talking about, passive syntheses, are seen as these operations of consciousness on unconsciousness on itself. And that's completely different than the faculties in difference and repetition, because those faculties are conscious.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, as far as I can see, this is what they are talking about, the unconscious here, I think. But I guess the idea would be that the unconscious through this third synthesis is what gives rise to consciousness, right? There's a kind of primary drive going on there, I suppose.
And it's interesting that, to take it back to Simondon, you've got the pre-individual, you've got the trans-individual, and then you've got the individual, which is between it, which, I associate with the body without organs. But the individual is maintained by these dynamics of the trans-individual and the pre-individual, or the desiring machines and the socius. There's operations that occur there that maintain the individual as a determinate, discrete thing. And so, but those operations are more or less unconscious. And so it seems, and that's where the passive syntheses come in, that on the desiring machine level, you have these three syntheses kind of in the micro, at the micro level, and then you have them operating at the macro level as well. But those unconscious syntheses as passive syntheses give rise to the individual, and then the individual can act. And Simondon calls that individualization rather than individuation. And so that in that process of individualization, the individual is acting and is conscious based on what it's given from the unconscious. But the unconscious is both these pre-individual things and trans-individual things that are not the focus of its awareness, but always have to be operating there in order to maintain the individual as something that continues to happen in time.
Sorry, I'm just having a little bit read through again of just a few passages here from this section, because that's one I wanted to find to bring up. So just bear with me.
Sure. Just while you're doing that, I mean, just mention this paragraph at the end of page 92, where he talks about Foucault. And, to me, that the most interesting thing about that paragraph is the last sentence, which it says luminous pages. That is high praise. They hardly ever say anything like that.
Yeah, although I think later Deleuze and Foucault fell out a little bit. Partly personal reasons, but
over things completely outside of their work. I mean,
yeah, well,
so
it was a social
political
thing,
and they had a disagreement over the utilization of the term desire. That's basically what it was. But I think the utilization of the history of madness here helps crystallize the point about familialism in psychoanalysis, and the role of that we've had this whole discussion today about the family as not just like an instantiation of social relations within capital, but like an actual engine too.
Yeah, just to mention that we're having a reading of Madness and Civilization over on the Continental Philosophy server. Did you find what you were looking for, Matt?
I think I've roughly found it, because in the Holland text is actually really, really useful. If anyone here is not using it, they should be. And I think contained towards the end of this chapter is one of their sort of 5 paralogisms of psychoanalysis. I was just trying to find sort of the really, the one sentence which kind of explains it. And maybe this is one of them at least, which in my copy is page 123, which is just a few pages before the end. Whence the magical formula that characterizes biunivocalization, the flattening of a polyvocal real in favor of a symbolic relationship between two articulations. So that is what this meant. Everything is made to begin with Oedipus by means of explanation, with all the more certainty as one has reduced everything to Oedipus by means of application. I think that's one of their major critiques, and I wasn't sure if maybe earlier before I joined in we'd sort of talked about that. Part of the problem with the way they write this, I think it was maybe Taylor pointed out to me last week that actually when you read the book in the original French, they don't actually have any of these subheadings, at least as I do in my copy. It was all just written as 3-4 big chapters. But one of the problems is that they kind of interweave their explanation of how the unconscious actually works with their critiques of how psychoanalysis makes illegitimate use of these syntheses, so that it's not always clear if they're sort of doing descriptive work or critical work at any given moment. But here, there was an interesting moment here because they talk about this later. I just realized that they make use of this phrase, but they say it can be applied to everything in that the agents and relations for social production and the libidinal investments corresponding to them are made to conform to the figures of familial reproduction. In the aggregate of departure, there is the social formation, or rather the social formations. The races, the classes, the continents, the peoples, the kingdoms, the sovereignties. Joan of Arc and the great Mongol, Luther and the Aztec serpent. In the aggregate of destination, there remains only Daddy, Mummy, and me. So they say that it must be said, and Oedipus, as well as design production, it's at the end, not at the beginning. So that's another one of their critiques of psychoanalysis here, and I wanted to just bring it up on recording in case that was something people haven't covered yet or maybe missed. It's just sort of prologism of application, the way in which it's used in this way.
Something I'd like to mention in the next paragraph, after the Foucault paragraph, after luminous pages, it says, let us add, by enveloping the illness in the familial complex internal to the patient than the familial complex itself, in the transference and the doctor-patient relationship, Freudian psychoanalysis is made a somewhat intensive use of the family. So, when I read, when I read this, whenever they talk about enveloping, that to me is an indication that they're talking about wild being. And but here, the kind of point is that the Oedipal complex, is used in Freudian analysis, and the way I think about it is it's used to deflect blame. Like, for instance, karma in India. Karma is there to deflect blame from the god. Right? If it basically says it's all your fault. In a previous life, you did something wrong. And so whatever is happening to you now is your fault in a previous life. So don't think it's the gods that have caused it. And
whereas here they really are saying no. Again, like, I think they're going to say that this really is your fault, right? This is what Deleuze and Guattari are talking about, the passage I read earlier about the double pincer movement towards ressentiment. That it inculcates a kind of bad faith in the individual. I think that's what they're going to want to say.
Well, the way I see it is that the whole, the patriarchal system in the West, psychoanalysis is using Edipolization to distribute blame for madness, and they're distributing the blame to the family. So it's not
right.
It's not the social institutions that are at fault for madness. It's the family.
Right, and there's something I was reading earlier. I think it might have been in Guattari's Three Ecologies, but it might be elsewhere. If it is, I'll find it for the chat. But it wrote that there's an evolution in Freud's thought, which you can observe, through his publications, which it shifts from at the start being that this kind of Oedipal complex is the fault of the parents, essentially, in his early writings, towards at the end that it is essentially the child which stands trial before the judges who are the parents.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I'll see if I can find that. I think it might have been Three Ecologies, but bear with me a moment there, because it could be interesting.
That's cool if that's true, because that's saying that, okay, we're going to distribute the fault to the parents, and then now the parents are going to distribute the fault to the child.
Yeah, it sounds like that. I think it was just saying that, in Freud's early writing, the fault lies largely with the parents, but towards his later writing, he's changed to a view that, it's essentially the child's fault, and that they're almost just sort of...
That same dynamic is taking place between Freud and Adler too, right? Like Freud is laying the blame at the feet of the parents, and then Adler is kind of shifting it back to the developmental behaviors of children.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know Adler well enough to... I mean, his thing was, he was kind of directly taking Nietzsche's will to power and using that as a psychoanalytic concept. Does anyone here know much about Adler? I'm afraid that's an area that I'm weak. So I think this distribution of blame. So what it means is that no structural changes are going to take place, and then this is kind of the critique of the bourgeoisie, that basically they're living their best life, and if the other people have to suffer because of that, they're not going to make any structural changes that are against their best interest.
So I'm not sure I necessarily have a thought on this specific chapter, but there was something which made me think about, which I wrote a few tweets about this a few days ago, and I figured it was worth saying, just for the sake of people sort of seeing where I'm coming from, or where I think Deleuze and Guattari are coming from, which is that, in a sense, the title Anti-Oedipus can be misleading, because, and I think this is one of the only ways of making sense of their relationship with Lacan in particular, but the basic idea is that Freud didn't invent Oedipus. They're very clear about that. It's fundamentally, the only way in which this is ever going to work out in terms of a social formation. What they're really trying to do, particularly with Lacan, is to historicize it, to relentlessly historicize it. That's the fundamental point. Not to show that he's entirely wrong per se, because they say, and we've read it so far multiple times in the chapters we've read together as a group, that society really is Edipolized, right? The patient arrives in the psychoanalyst's room pre-Edipolized, right? The point isn't to sort of say that, no, Freud is wrong, this isn't how individuals today operate, or society operates. It's to say that it hasn't quite brought itself to this kind of historicist auto-critique in a way that Marx did with Smith, for example. And so that was something I wanted to sort of repeat vocally rather than just through a tweet, because I think it can be a misunderstanding, right, that this is just a sort of full-out assault on Freud and Lacan, and it isn't. They think that if Freud hadn't said what he'd said, someone else would have said it as well, because that's just, how it works. But the point then is to historicize it and to show how these forms of psychic repression are rooted in a determinate social field, and therefore to locate in sort of political, economic, and historic terms the way in which this arose, and then also to show how that therefore makes it amenable to change, right? How we can sort of de-Edipolize, how we can become anti-Oedipal.
Yeah, my question then would be, how do we apply that same framework to Anti-Oedipus as it relates to later pages where they're discussing the role that sociologists and anthropologists play in Edipolizing other cultures? Like, I'm thinking back to like the early Calastres meeting. I'm thinking about like savages, barbarians, and civilized men. Like in there, they specifically state that like there's an entire like academic body of individuals who are like now trying to Edipolize other kind of quote unquote prehistorical social organizations. So I'm just wondering how you would apply that same concept of it's there, right? It's present, but now we're also trying to find it in other places. And what D&G say is that when we're doing that, we're actually just positing it there. We're not finding it there. We're positing it.
Yeah, and that's because they think that it's a sort of a form of desire, a kind of repressed or displaced desire, specific to the kinds of Western capitalist countries that it's arisen in. But they're also going to want to say that, as you said, that in a sense, yes, the patient already arrives Edipolized in a way, right, to the psychoanalyst's sofa. But what psychoanalysis also does, and they're going to say this about anthropology and sociology as well, is that it encourages a kind of Oedipal imperialism as well. And so that's why they're also really, really critical of psychoanalysis, because it participates, replicates, and worsens this process, when really we need to be finding ways of resisting or attacking it. Which is why, for example, you might have heard all sorts of funny stories about Guattari and his time at Laborde. And one story I heard is that if any of the patients formed like monogamous relationships, he would essentially go around breaking them up because he was worried that they were becoming Edipolized into the triangle again. And he wouldn't let any of his sort of workers marry or anything like that. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it could be sort of an urban myth. But I think those two things they're not necessarily intention to say that, on the one hand, they're clearly very critical of psychoanalysis and the Oedipal complex. But they're also going to want to say, I think, that it's psychoanalysis didn't invent it, but it will reproduce it, strengthen it, and force it on others as well. Absolutely.
Just to connect this back to our earlier discussion, I think this is really at the core of the start of our section here, because what they point out here, again, they have pointed out earlier, is that the problem with psychoanalysis is that it suspects Oedipus is there even if it isn't, or even if it isn't visible. Right, that's the point where they talk about foreclosure, and then they go on in the section to the section about organizers and inductors to find a way to talk about Oedipus or structuring principles like Oedipus that doesn't presume that it's there in its absence. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that I'd like to mention that I've mentioned before is this book by Gao called Oedipus Philosopher. And in that book, he points out that Oedipus is an anomaly in relationship to the monomyth of the hero's initiation. And so, when you look at it within its mythic context, it's just interesting that what's focused on is this anomaly, rather than the the initiation myth of the hero itself, which is the more general thing, which is prevalent in the mythology. And then another point is that in colonialization, basically the colonists treat the indigenous people they've taken over and are exploiting as children. And so that in colonialization, that's the way the Edipolization is enforced onto cultures that probably don't have it, say if they're matriarchal. So is there, Matt's had to leave us, or anyone else would like to discuss any other issues in the text?
I think this might be the time to get Craig out of here so that we can have some sort of concise stopping point. I think right there is a good place to do it. So I'm going to ask Craig to leave. But if anybody has one last comment that they want to put in before I turn him off, speak now or forever hold your